homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today I am out in the greenhouse potting up some tomatoes that I'm growing this year. And I have a video, several videos actually from last year, on how I make my own seed starting mix, how I make my own potting soil, how I start my tomatoes and other plants in terms of getting things warm enough that I get quick germination. So I'm not going to go into that a lot this year. But I've been thinking about the political situation, which I'm also not going to get into. But I've been thinking about food security and regional food systems and local food systems. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about if you're thinking about these things and thinking that maybe you should double down on trying to grow your own food this year instead of relying on the grocery store as prices just keep going up and up and up and up, and we have all the unpredictability of the tariffs affecting prices, which I totally understand because I'm doing that for sure. I thought I'd talk a little bit about if you have a limited amount of room, or you have a limited amount of finances, or you have a limited amount of time, how do you decide what you want to double down on? What are you going to get the most bang for your buck? What are you going to grow that is going to do the best job of feeding your family long term, that's going to give you some insulation from all volatility in terms of the prices? And so I thought I'd go through that a little bit and chat about it while I'm potting up some tomatoes. So this is some of the last of my tomatoes. And rather than starting things in individual pots, I just fill a 10-20 tray, which is what this is called because it's 10 inches by 20 inches. I fill this with soil, and then I plant 7 or 8 tomatoes per 10-inch space. And sometimes I put 2 in each hole if it's older seed. And then I go do what's called pricking out when they get to be about this size and transplant them into 4-inch pots. And this is the only transplant that I do until I plant them out in the garden. So these will be big enough to give them enough room that they'll be fine for the next 6 weeks or so. Our planting date for tomatoes around here is, we are in southeast Washington, zone 7A or 7B. And the general rule of thumb is plant your tomatoes on Mother's Day. Our last frost date is usually right around the 1st of May. You can see this one is 2, so that was 2 seeds in the same pot. And I'm just going to very gently divide those up. So, planting your garden. You are a never ever, or if you need to scale back because of time constraints or money constraints, here are some of my thoughts on what do you prioritize. This is especially if you're a never ever gardener and you're brand new to gardening, because we tend to get really excited and we want to grow all of the things in the spring, and then we get to July when the weeds are taller than we are, and we realize maybe we shouldn't have tried to grow all of the things because it's way too much to keep up, and we end up just running out of energy and feeling bad about what we've done, and so we abandon the garden, and that's a bummer for everybody. And it's also a waste of money and time because you spend a lot of time in the spring. So my thoughts are, start out by planting the stuff that you buy at the grocery store already. So if every time you go to the grocery store, you buy carrots, or you buy salad blend mix, you know, that prepackaged stuff that's ready to go, then maybe that would be a good place to start in terms of what to plant in your garden, because you're clearly spending money on that every week. If you, every time you go to the store, or most times when you go to the store, you buy canned tomato products, whether that's canned tomatoes, diced tomatoes, salsa, ketchup, barbecue sauce, those are all things that you can make from your own tomatoes that you grew in your garden if you are wanting to learn how to can and preserve. And so you can replace all of those with your own product by growing enough tomatoes and then learning how to can and process. So that would be an example. Secondly, grow something that gives you multiple harvests. And so if you think about back into maybe 2nd grade or so, when you learned about the different parts of a plant, and there was the root, the stem, the leaves, the flowers, and the fruit, kind of in that order. If we're harvesting the root of a plant, we're obviously, that's a one-time harvest. We don't get multiple harvests from carrots. We harvest them once and then we're done. So the root, you're going to harvest the whole thing. And on certain brassicas like kohlrabi or cauliflower or cabbage to a great extent, it's a one-time harvest. You harvest it once and then you're done. That plant is done. One-time harvest versus tomatoes, peppers. What you're actually harvesting there is the fruit, and that fruit is going to, when you take it off, that plant is trying to reproduce itself. And as soon as you remove that fruit, it says, oh, I failed, I need to grow some more. And so it will grow more fruit to make up for the fruit that you removed. And so a lot of things that fruit will continue to fruit if you keep picking, just like your flowers will continue to flower if you take off the dead flowers, the ones that are finished, if you deadhead. And so planting things that fruit, definitely a good idea. And then a lot of times things that are leafy, you can also harvest the leaves multiple times and they will keep growing back, usually until it gets too hot. So things like lettuce and kale and Swiss chard, mustard greens, spinach, you can harvest the leaves at the right time of year and it will grow more leaves. A lot of times those are seasonal crops and they do get to the point where it's either too hot or too cold or whatever and they stop growing. So it's somewhat limited, but you can usually get multiple harvests from leafy things. And then thirdly, grow what you have room for, which seems pretty obvious. But I have a friend who kind of his gardening, ask a gardening questions. He'll send me a text and he's lived in multiple places in the country. And I get these texts from Arizona. Right now I'm getting texts from Montana where he'll ask me random gardening questions, which I just love. But he has a very small space this year to grow in, but he wants to grow a garden. And he said that he wanted to grow corn and cucumbers and something else. I'll put it on the screen. I can't remember what he said. And it was like a 4-by-8 foot space. It was really tiny. And my comment was, don't grow corn. Corn takes up a ton of room. Water hog, it's a fertilizer hog, it's a space hog. And for every corn stalk you grow, if you're lucky, you get 2 ears of corn. And then it's done. It's not going to grow more corn because you picked the corn that was on there. And it's also one of those things that a lot of people grow in the summertime. A lot of bigger farms and farmers markets have a lot of corn on hand. And you can get it for usually pretty inexpensive and get some really good quality fresh corn from your local area for not a whole lot of money. And so my advice to him was don't grow corn. Grow other things in that small space. Put the tall stuff towards the back, which in his case would be the north end of the bed so that it's not shading out the stuff in front of it. Put the short stuff in the front, but don't grow corn. Just buy corn, support your local farmers, get it cheap when it's in season, and then process it accordingly. And actually that's what I've done often in different years as well for sweet corn, because it does take up a lot of room and you don't get a whole lot of bang for your buck. It's gratifying if you have enough room for it, but maybe that's not the best choice. So grow what you have room for. And that includes doing things like getting creative and going vertical. You can grow a lot more things in spaces that are vertical than you can if everything is horizontal, especially things like cucumbers, which take up a ton of room if you grow them horizontally, but if you grow them vertically, you can get a lot of cucumber out of a small space. And so get creative. And then things like green stalks or garden towers where you can stack multiple plants into a fairly small space if you've only got a balcony or a porch and you don't have a lot of actual growing room. And in terms of what you have room for, that also applies to not overplanting things if you don't have the capacity to actually process them. So maybe don't put in 15 tomato plants if you can, or if you don't have a big chest freezer where you can put ripe tomatoes. So think about the end result, unless you're planning on donating a lot of stuff to your local food bank or your friends, which is actually fantastic. So that's also certainly something you can do. But if you don't have the capacity to process a lot of what you're growing into things and you're really just going to be eating it fresh, take that into consideration. I'll put some books up here on the screen that are really good for planning. How much food do you actually need if you're going to be processing things? Because sometimes that's great for helping you plan. But if you're just planning for fresh eating, contemplate how much lettuce a week do you buy and then work on growing that amount. How many canned tomatoes do you use in a month? Work on growing that amount and do that multiplication. So don't overplant as well, because maybe you can use that space for something else that's going to give you some good bang for your buck. Grow for the conditions that you have. Certain plants can be really challenging depending on where you live. I lived in Northwest Colorado for many years at almost 7,000 feet. And without having a greenhouse or some kind of season extension cover, growing peppers in that climate was virtually impossible. You could pull off something if you grew smaller peppers that tended to come on pretty quickly, like cayennes, or if you were growing some of the heirloom Native American varieties from the Hopi Pueblos that were also at high elevation and were fairly small. But for me to get a bell pepper out of that climate when I had less than 100 growing days, and the nights were almost never out of the 40s, was impossible without having a small greenhouse or row cover or something in that space. I have tried here in Southeast Washington to grow okra every year for about the last 4 or 5 years, and we are not well suited for okra. And I have enough room that I can get away with wasting some time and space on okra every year. But honestly, if I were in a real food production crunch where I needed to make sure that everything I grew was going to be successful, I wouldn't bother growing okra because I get a handful every year before the plants just kind of peter out. We're not the right climate for it. Another example of that is Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts don't work well here. We have a lot of aphid pressure on our brassicas, and Brussels sprouts are a very long season crop. They can take well over 100 days to mature. And that entire time you are fighting the aphids on the Brussels sprouts and having to spray constantly, whether it's just a strong stream of water or a soapy solution or some kind of actual insecticide. And the plants just aren't really happy. And then a lot of times they don't bunch up and make great big Brussels sprouts the way they're supposed to because we're just not really the right climate for them here. And so not something I'm going to waste a lot of time on. Another example, unfortunately, is winter squash. We have very high squash bug pressure here, not squash vine borers. Those are different. But actual squash bugs we have a lot of. And I find that if I move my bed of squash a good distance every year, so like a couple 100 feet from one location to another, it usually takes about a year for the squash bugs to really get bad. And so I can eke out a crop, and I figured out which varieties of squash seem to do better with squash bug pressure and which don't. And so if I move my bed, I can get a crop every year, but sometimes I don't have the room or the irrigation or the bandwidth to be moving things around all the time, and I just don't bother growing squash because it is definitely a difficult crop to pull off here because of the insect pressure. And, you know, winter squash is a great staple because they don't need a lot of attention once you harvest them. You can put them in a garage or just under your bed, as long as they don't freeze, and they will store for months. And so it's something that I'm really loath to give up completely because they are such a good winter staple, but very frustrating in terms of the squash bug pressure. And everything I've tried, nothing is really successful long-term, organic or non-organic. They just get hammered in our area. And that kind of leads into the other one I have, which is grow for preservation. Again, you are somebody who has room to store in a freezer or a food dehydrator or a big pantry that you can store jarred canned goods in, then by all means, don't just grow for fresh eating. Grow for what makes the most sense in terms of food preservation. It may not be super exciting, but it will keep your family fed, and you can get creative with what comes out of that jar and make incredible meals in the wintertime. So yeah, grow for preservation. And again, I'll put a couple links to some books on the screen. There are some really great books out there that more importantly help you think about how to calculate what you actually use in a year and how to stock up on that. For instance, my husband really loves salsa, and when he's not dieting, because corn chips can be a lot of calories, he will easily go through a jar of salsa a week. And if I do that math, that means I want to have 52 jars of salsa on hand every year. That's a lot. That's a lot of canning. That's at least 5 batches, if not 6 batches of salsa. I make pretty big batches. And then a lot of room for storage to store 52 jars of salsa every year. But you can do that math and figure it out. And then another one that I don't think gets talked about enough, which is grow for what is more pesticide laden at the store so that you have some control over how much pesticide you're eating. And everybody draws this line in the sand in a different place. Some people have more risk or less risk assessment when it comes to these kind of things. And I've done many deep dives on whether or not something I think is worth pursuing or not. But the Environmental Working Group comes out with a list every year of what they call the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen. And it is actually not based on their testing, but on the testing that the USDA does every year on typical produce. And so you can look up, and again, it's based on government data, not their data. It's just reporting that everybody was missing until they started covering it, of what has the most pesticide residue and what has the most number of different pesticides on produce. By the way, I am taking the extra soil that are in these grow trays after I prick out the tomatoes, and I'm just using it as potting soil and potting them up so nothing's going to waste here. And I've used this for years as I've gone in and out of having more or less room to grow and more or less financial wherewithal. Sometimes I'm buying organic at the store, but I'm only buying organic of the things that are on that Dirty Dozen list because I know that they're going to be especially laden with pesticides, versus the Clean 15 list, which includes onions, it includes avocados, it includes sweet potatoes. I don't feel like I need to spend a lot of extra money on those items to get organic because they're pretty darn clean already from the store, from just conventional stuff. It just means it's a plant that, given the region that it's grown in and the way that it's grown, it doesn't require a lot of pesticides in order to get a crop that is not damaged. And so those are things to think about as well. And it also is very helpful when you're just looking at your budget and trying to decide what you should double down and spend organic versus what you just simply can't afford to buy organic. And so you're going to buy conventional, where that money is going to give you the best bang for your buck. And then lastly, of course, certainly if you have the room, but also simply because it gives you motivation, is grow things that bring you joy. I love growing peppers. If I had to get down to I could only grow one thing and nothing else, peppers are what I would grow. I love growing peppers above all other things. It can be 100 degrees outside and miserable, and if I'm out picking ripe peppers, I am happy despite the heat. Versus, let's say, green beans, where you have to pick them every 2 days. They tend to be ripe in July and August when it's really, really hot. I don't love green beans enough to make me excited to go out in the garden and pick them when it's really, really hot. So I don't grow a lot of green beans, but I do grow a lot of peppers. Flowers are wonderful for bringing in pollinators, for bringing in the good insects that help fight the bad insects. And they also are just simply beautiful. You can cut bouquets and bring them in the house. You can just enjoy them in place in the garden. But more and more as I get older, growing flowers is bringing me incredible joy. And that has been really, really important to me in terms of maintaining my motivation to go out into the garden, even at the height of summer when the weeds are getting bad and the temperature is miserable and I still have work to do. So most of the tomatoes that you see in this video are going to be for sale at the end of April and beginning of May of this year. I am only growing a total of 8 tomatoes in my raised bed garden area because my big garden that I normally grow over 35 tomatoes in is going to be leased out this year. So the tomatoes I'm growing this year are some Brandywines, some Anise Noir beefsteaks, a Dr. Wychie, a Principesi Borghese cherry tomato that I've grown for over 20 years, a Sun Gold cherry tomato, and a couple of Oxheart paste tomatoes. What are you guys growing this year? So there you have it, tribe. Those are my thoughts on how to get the most bang for your buck in your garden when you're limited on time, space, or financial resources. What are you guys doing this year in your garden to prepare for extra food security? Or do you not think it's an issue and you're just kind of keeping on as you've always been? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.